Everyone, welcome back. We're back live. Thanks for joining us on I Love Dentistry. And we have an expert panel today. And today's topic is your dental office secure? And we're joined by Amy Wood. Thanks for joining us. And Kara Kelly. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Oh, you got it. All right. So let me do a quick bio for each of you. And then I think first I just wanted to, after I read the bio, just kind of get into your story, how each of you got into dentistry and what each of you offer, which is super important these days. Okay, so Amy is a best-selling author, speaker, consultant, and coach. She has a background in healthcare information technology and has spent the last decade as a HIPAA educator, risk assessor, and data breach consultant. Services offered by her company, Copper Penny Consulting, include compliance courses, HIPAA compliance consulting, and data breach consulting. That is awesome. And Kara works with dental practice leaders to develop strategic HR systems that engage their team and strengthen their practice. She's the founder and CEO of Clinical HR LLC, a human resources advisory firm for dental practices. Kara has a BS in business with a concentration in human resource management. She is a Society for Human Resource Management senior certified professional and holds a senior professional in human resources designation from the HR Certification Institute. She is also a member of the Academy of Dental Management Consultants. So thank you two for joining us. And can each of you just kind of give me a little bit of a background on how you got into dentistry?
Sorry, do you want to go first, Kara?
Sure. I actually ended up working with dentists about 10 years ago when I started working at a CPA firm that was a dental CPA firm. So I kind of thought that I was going to go join an HR company or go join a corporation and climb up that HR ladder, and none of that actually happened. I kind of ended up building myself a position as an HR and business development consultant at that firm. And one of the things I talked about was fraud and embezzlement and how it's a people problem, not a numbers problem, and making sure that that was something that my clients were aware of and prepared for. We had several stories throughout that time. So about 2.5 years ago, I decided I was tired of being mistaken for an accountant, and I started my own firm that is 100% HR, and I don't have to do accounting or taxes or teach practice 101 finance anymore. So yay.
So strictly just HR these days.
Just HR. I would rather deal with the people problems than the numbers.
Gotcha. And go ahead, Amy. What about yourself?
So I've always worked in healthcare in some way, shape, or form since I was 14 years old. I've worked direct patient care in nursing homes, hospitals, surgical ICUs, saw a lot of blood, and now I'm on the other end where I don't ever have to see blood again. It's amazing. I started doing IT work with my husband, and we had been focusing mostly on dentists. So kind of like everyone else, we just kind of fell into it and found a place that we really enjoy. And then my own dental x-rays were involved in a data breach, and my identity was sold on the dark web. And that was my moment where I decided, you know what, this is stupid and this is preventable. And all these doctors we work with really don't understand the value of the information that they have care, custody, and control of. And I still say that because they still don't understand that this information has a lot of value. And all these years later, I've helped a lot of offices get through data breach investigations, mostly unscathed, at least with no fines or penalties. But you know, it's just been a long journey, and I still have a lot to offer the dental community.
So was that your eureka moment when your x-rays were sold on the dark web?
Well, there were some 4-letter words, but yeah. Yeah, so what happened there was a hospital purchased the imaging center where my panos were taken. And I should actually back up. I had orthodontic upper and lower realignment from a class 3 bite, just genetics. And after that surgery, I had multiple panos taken, and the imaging center had been acquired by the hospital, and the hospital sent their IT department over to transfer all these x-rays, and the front desk person had never worked with that level of IT engagement. And so they only ever had what we call a break fix guy who comes in and fixes something on an hourly fee, and then they walk away. And so she didn't trust the IT department. She had no relationship with them and made an unauthorized copy onto a thumb drive and then lost it. And I air quotes that because all of that information ended up on the dark web. So my name, birth date, social security number, and my insurance medical record number are still for sale today, over a decade later.
Wow. And Kara, what was your kind of your eureka moment where you started to get into HR?
I mean, I started to get into HR whenever I was in school for a marketing degree and took my first HR class as a general business credit and kind of fell in love with it. So where I kind of got to the point where I wanted to work with dentists and had that moment, just working with a number of startups, working with a number of clients through the CPA firm, I realized that they're their own HR. They're going to be their own HR for the next 10, 20, 40 years, hopefully, unless they sell their practice to a larger corporation and then they get an HR department. This is something that is going to be on them, and they don't get any training on that in dental school.
Can you actually just kind of quickly explain exactly what HR means?
It's human resources. It is actually 7 different sectors, but for the most part, it's dealing with your employee relations, the recruiting and onboarding process, how you're paying your people, how you deal with the compliance. Those are the things that I really love to work with.
Now, for what both of you do, in protecting a dental office, I imagine, so I started in a practice that was already well established. It was a large office with many employees, but I imagine when you're starting out from scratch, you start with yourself and maybe 1 or 2 other people. But as you grow and get bigger, more money, more problems, you start to increase employees and you can increase potential issues. Do you both of you find that as the office gets bigger, that you're having more HR issues, you're having more breaches or HIPAA or security issues?
More people, more problems, more risk. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. There's always one in a group that the larger the organization, the more likely they're going to find a loophole to do something that's risky.
But I've seen it happen in a team of 3. And that one person who had, actually the person who did the embezzling, had worked with them for 12 years, and it was a shock. So it is not always the new person that you just hired that happens to have an ulterior motive. Sometimes it's the person that's been there for the longest.
Now, is this going to happen, or can we prevent, either of what you focus on from happening? What are we looking for? How do we prevent this from happening? What are your recommendations for having, preventing issues?
From the people side or from the cybersecurity side?
Both.
I mean, there's never going to be a 100% guarantee. Just like with recent breaches in large dental organizations, there's not something you can always do to prevent your information from getting out there, but you can certainly mitigate that risk. You can certainly be aware of how that information can get out there, and how your money can be lost.
I call it predictable failures. You're never going to have a big enough budget to stop everything from happening. You're never going to know all the latest threats, but you can put a plan in place to minimize them. So it's a little problem, not a massive problem.
And Kara, what would you say is the most common HR issue that you see in a dental office?
From the protection side, the fact that background checks don't happen almost ever.
Which is a HIPAA requirement, by the way.
It's terrible. I don't know why. I really don't. Or they'll substitute an actual background check for, well, I ran a Google search. Okay. Here's a fun fact. If you run a Google search for my name spelled correctly, you're going to find a Canadian author who writes erotica. She looks similar to me. She has dark hair, but it's not me. And if you were background checking me that way with a Google search, you would probably be background checking the wrong person. And even if you figured it out later, by the way, that's what you're going to think about when I'm sitting in front of you in an interview.
I actually Googled my name and I came up as like some professor. And then there was like some high school wrestler champion. So I thought that was kind of cool, but it wasn't me. Amy, go ahead from your point of view. I'm sorry, I forgot my question. Kara, what did I ask you? The most common HR issue? Amy, what's the most common
cybersecurity issue?
Yeah. Thank you.
It's usually not nefarious. It's usually accidentally opening an email. So we focus heavily on spear phishing and education on what to look for. And if it looks funky, stop and ask a professional. IT providers often have tools now where they can open something in what we call a sandbox, where it won't get out into the rest of the computer network, so they can see what that email attachment will do in a safe environment. But normal people just don't have access to that. So you need the nerds and geeks of the world to do that for you.
Well, and you also need to be paying attention and have your people trained to look for those types of things, trained to hover over the link and see what the link actually is before you click here or whatever it is they're asking you to do.
Or learn how to spell correctly. That's my favorite one. Yeah, I see a lot of them from Amazon instead of Amazon, and LinkedIn with an exclamation instead of the capital I.
Mm-hmm.
So are these actual fraudulent emails that are coming in? Okay.
All the time. Just for fun, I turn off my spam filter every once in a while and just see what comes in, and I grab screenshots of it, and that's what goes into my trainings.
Yeah. So everyone out there, don't click when it says Amazon.
I had some recently that looked like they were coming from one of my clients, but I know better, and I did not open that one.
So, Kara, you mentioned background checks. How do we properly do a background check if it's not just, Googling the person's name?
Hire a company to do it. There's actually a lot of rules surrounding background checks, and depending on what state you're in, you may be subject to what's called ban the box legislation, which means you can't even do a background check until after you've made an offer. It's probably a best practice anyway, so I usually advise my clients to do that regardless of whether or not they're subject to it, because I think more and more states are moving that direction. But hiring a company that actually understands these rules, that can protect the information from your job applicant, from your candidate that you're looking to hire, and making sure that that company is actually going to do it thoroughly. Some of these like cheap $20 background checks are not going to be thorough. One of the companies I actually like to refer is Imperative. Imperativeinfo.com is their website. It's run by a gentleman named Mike Coffey, and I love him to death. He's spoken at a lot of SHRM chapters, Society for Human Resource Management chapters. I don't just love him because his last name is Coffey, even though that's my jam. But he's actually incredibly thorough, and he does education on how to properly do background checks for HR professionals. So I would 100% recommend his company. But things like Good Hire, there's other companies out there that will do them. They're not the cheapest thing in the world, but quite honestly, if you're looking at somebody's history and how much people are losing in dental practices because they've hired the wrong person, somebody who they might have been aware of prior to, if they'd have done a background check, it's worth the $75, $125, whatever, couple $100 it ends up being for your background check.
Do you think
Totally
because of the staffing issues that every industry is experiencing right now, especially dentistry, that people are foregoing these background checks and they're just quick to pull the trigger and hire someone?
They were doing it before the pandemic, before all of these issues. This has been a long time problem.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they just don't know to do it, but more often it's because they're trying to save money on the hiring process.
I had an interesting situation. I had an office manager that ended up getting arrested for embezzlement in one of our offices that we worked with. And then she kept showing up in other offices that we worked with as a new hire. And I'd have to call the doctor and say, did you do a background check? Did you talk to her former employer? Did you do any of this stuff? No. We were just desperate for a warm body.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, you're going to find out very quickly that was a terrible idea.
I had a client a couple of years ago when I was still with the financial firm that they had their team of 3 people, came home one day. This is an older dentist looking to retire at some point, but came home one day to a note on their door from an inspector. And the inspector was like, "Hey, I need you to give me a call." Well, what had been happening is the office manager, the front desk person, was actually issuing retroactive discounts through the credit card machine. So patients would pay and then she would issue a retroactive discount and it would go to her own personal account. And the merchant services company is the one that actually caught that in the end, that she had been doing that for about 3 years. And so the inspector was telling my client, by the way, we're going to be arresting her next Tuesday at 7:15 in your office. Just act like nothing's happening. They said the hardest thing they had to do was give that woman her paycheck that Friday without saying a word about it. But that's what ended up happening. And then a couple months later, she got out of jail and was working for another practice. And they found out and they're like, "We never got a call for a reference check, nothing. She's just out working again. She'd been doing it for 3 years, and the last count I heard was something like $180,000 that she'd embezzled over that 3 years.
Is that the proper next steps? Is when you suspect something, is that, are you finding that companies are hiring, a company like yours too late? Should they be contacting the authorities? What's the proper steps if you suspect suspicious activity?
An internal investigation first, because you don't want to accuse somebody of something that may or may not be them. That's not my company. There are companies out there. I know Prosperident's one of them. Just Melvillec is one of them. There's a lot of companies out there that'll come in and actually, like, you don't even have to send them on vacation anymore. They'll come in and they'll do this basically in the middle of the night when nobody's realizing that they're investigating the practice management software, and they'll do an internal audit and find where that money's going.
On the
That's the
tech
next
side,
step. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the tech side, the most difficult thing for those investigators is that most dental practices do not enforce unique users for logins. So especially in the clinical area, the first person who comes in the morning, they log in under their login, and everything in the audit trail digitally shows as it's this assistant that logged in. And so everything's under her login. And it's really confusing, and it's really hard to parse out who did what and when.
And that can definitely make it more difficult to prosecute. The other thing too is so many dentists just don't. They are embarrassed, they feel afraid, they just don't want to have to deal with that side of things, and so they just let them go. And we'll sometimes let them go with it's just not working out. And that person goes and draws unemployment for a little bit, and then goes and works for another practice and does the same thing.
And Amy, you mentioned unique logins. So for example, if we have someone that's at a workstation and they are, getting up and leaving for the afternoon to go to a different workstation, they log out and the next person logs in with their own unique username and password. Is that the best way to do it?
Yeah. And I'm talking about the practice management level. So Windows login, you can have a general login in the clinical area. It theoretically, it should be individual, but in a dental office, it's really difficult to do that. But definitely in the practice management, the problem we have is that you have assistants and doctors that go from room to room to room, and they don't want to log out and log back in all the time. But I've found that fighting it is actually more expensive and time consuming than embracing it. And that's pretty much true with everything with regulation and basic business best practices for security.
And how often should we be changing our passwords?
Well, the way that things are written is not what people want to hear. It's supposed to be every 90 days. But there's a couple different rules of thought with passwords. So if you have a really strong password that you don't use at home, it's not recycled or reused, and it's not your dog's name or your kids' names or your phone number, the common easy things, and it's not the same as your Facebook login, then you don't necessarily have to change that as frequently. So it could be once a year. But if you're using something like password 1234 as your password, that first of all should never be used. But those are the kinds of passwords that if you want it quick and easy, you need to change it more frequently.
Do you recommend like keeping a spreadsheet of, that the whole, or, if it's, let's say, logging into Dentrix or logging into, the practice management software or a portal for a lab, do you recommend keeping like a spreadsheet so every time you change it in 90 days that everyone knows? What's the best approach there?
Your password is your password, and no one else should know what it is. If it needs to be reset, it can be reset. But your password is unique to you and should never be shared. As far as saving things, the first thing that something like ransomware will grab is a spreadsheet titled passwords, or PW. So if it's for websites, use a password manager. I'm a huge fan of LastPass Corporate. one login. There's a ton of them out there, but you can set them so that certain people have access to shared passwords and they don't see what those passwords are. So if you have a front desk person that goes away, that you terminate them, they leave their job, whatever the case may be, you don't have to reset every single one of those insurance logins or bank logins. And you can have all under the same master account. You can have access to your business banking and retirement accounts and payroll and all these other things. And those other team members won't have access to it, but they'll have access to the things that they need to do their job.
And Kara, I wanted to ask you, I was just jotting some things down. You mentioned, the background checks. Let's say we've gone through all that, we've hired some people, we feel like we have a good team. What's your recommendation for, keeping this team happy, preventing HR staffing issues? What's your recommendations there?
Your culture is going to be first. And that also goes for this culture of security, like what Amy's talking about. If you're setting this example that, you're not sharing passwords, you're not letting your team be lax on security, that's going to drive a culture of security mindset. And so if you're looking at a culture for employee retention, making sure that they're paid at market value, making sure that they have enough PTO to be able, especially to meet your state laws if your state requires it, but enough PTO to actually have a life outside of work. I know they're there 4 or 5 days a week usually, but sometimes they still need that time off. And so making sure that you're allowing them to take that. And then just in general, a culture of appreciation. Right now, especially if you're competing with the larger corporate practices, or just in general, you're competing with other companies that are out there that can offer more than what dentistry can in terms of working from home, in terms of flexibility with their schedule from a day-to-day basis, and in terms of benefits like health insurance or 401k if you don't have those in a smaller practice. You're competing with other companies that are not dental. So you really have to focus on what you can do to compete with that, which is make sure that you have a positive culture of gratitude and appreciation for the team that is helping you run your practice. Dentistry is a team activity. You can't just do it by yourself. You have to have these people there. And so yes, they are there to work for you, but that's a real transactional mindset that they're there for a paycheck and they're there to do what you need them to do. If you're building a community of appreciation and a community of respect with each other, and a community of a security mindset, that's all going to help drive your team to want to actually stay, to want to actually invite other people to come on your team. And it's one of the ways you can get past this recruiting nightmare that we're having is if you have a fantastic culture and this is a great place to work, your team members will talk. They will say, oh my gosh, you've got to come work for my practice. So that's one way that you can actually get ahead of the game when it comes to recruiting in this era. I actually did an ebook about this a couple months ago that I can send you a link to if you want to drop it in the chat for all the listeners. That's all about culture and things you should do.
That would be great. And I think, what you mentioned is so important. And I struggle every day as a leader. And I think what you mentioned there is the culture of appreciation. I think that is awesome. What's your recommendations there for keeping that, that great culture of appreciation? Do you recommend one-on-ones, department meetings, and then team-wide meetings? How do you kind of keep everyone on the same page?
Yes, yes, and yes. I'm a big fan of morning huddles as far as keeping people on the same page. And then as far as like reviews go, you're talking about performance development meetings. I can't stand the annual review because it is so tied to salary and their mindset. And you're only going to be looking at the last couple of months and it's likely going to be negative. You don't generally remember all of the great things that have happened throughout the year. So I actually like to work on a 90-day cycle and do it every 3 months or so of a check-in with your team. And that's something that I have a form for that I hand out to my clients. I have a worksheet that the team member can actually fill out to make this an efficient use of their time, because it usually should be about 10, 15 or so minutes of, this is what I feel like could be improved on. These are the things that I set for my goals the last 90 days. Here's where I'm at with that. Here's my goals for the next 90 days. That way you're really checking in with your team and soliciting that feedback on a more regular basis than once a year.
And Amy, what do you recommend for everyone being on the the up and up with HIPAA and cybersecurity and just being safe? Do you recommend just once a year checking in or more often?
Well, there's actually some requirements. So when HIPAA came out in '96, and we're all old enough to remember that, sadly, the The original law said periodic training, and it wasn't very clear as to what that meant. Now, the resolution agreement, so all the people that have gone through investigations, they always have this thing called a corrective action plan. And in those, we know what the investigators actually want. So they want new team members to be trained before they're granted access to any systems containing protected health information. So before they touch a computer, they must be trained in how HIPAA applies to your office. And then they need to do annual team training together. And both of those make perfect sense because one, you don't want the new person to come in with bad habits and expectations from their last job. Maybe they didn't even embrace HIPAA or spell it correctly in their last office. Happens all the time.
I can never spell it right.
I know. Every time you send me something, it's spelled wrong. I'm like, dude, come on. We can get this right. I got you. And then the team training, it gives everybody a chance to kind of talk together about what's working, what's not working, try to come up with ways to comply with the laws and keep up with the threats that are happening. I'm also a big fan of spear phishing campaigns. Know Before is kind of the big one that's out there. I actually know a lot of people that work there, and they'll send you spear phishing emails and see if you click on them. And it kind of gives the business owner situational awareness to see who's naughty on the internet and who's risky and who's a good person. And my father-in-law is a brilliant person, probably one of the smartest people I know, as an electrical engineer, and he falls for it every time. And I give him so much grief every single time.
I have a question for you, Amy, actually.
Sure.
You'd mentioned that it's a requirement to have team members trained before they touch any protected health information. How often are you seeing that happen versus people just, especially right now with, hiring and so desperate to hire and just throwing them in before they actually get their training done?
Well, and training is this ambiguous word because training in their mind is this 20-minute pre-recorded video on the basics of HIPAA that has nothing to do with dentistry or their specific job role. So, I mean, I've gone above and beyond. I have videos for clinical team, for admin team. I have pre-recorded things that I did that's 10 minutes. And I can tell you, even with my clients that are well-trained and are on board, and they pay me a retainer every month to make sure that I keep them out of trouble, I'm really only seeing about 10% of those that are training their new team members. So it's kind of sad.
That's a devastatingly low statistic.
It's mildly insulting. Yeah, it's really horrible because when I usually find out that there's a new office manager or a new assistant or a new hygienist, it's usually when they're calling my IT company and badgering them to do something that they're not supposed to be doing. And then my IT team is calling me and saying, hey, you need to contact them and make sure that this new person isn't going to screw things up because she's already doing dumb things.
Now, Amy, was it you that mentioned that the ADA got hacked?
Well, Kara brought it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was joking. I know Amy knew all about that.
I think I knew about it before the rest of the press releases and general public knew about it. So I do a lot of work with government agencies because of what I do with data breaches and cybersecurity. And the ADA, same thing. They opened a spear phishing email. Someone on their team saw an email that looked convincing enough. They opened it. It ran ransomware. It's kind of a massive thing because ADA has access to a lot of information about dentists. They have a whole practice transitions division, which that's a lot of financial information when people transition to new ownership. Continuing education units, people that issue continuing educations through ADA. Mine's through AGD, so mine wasn't affected, but now I'm kind of crawling up AGD and making sure that they're all secure, so that's not an issue. The larger concern is that it's affecting the state level components. So there's Florida, New York, Kansas, Virginia, a whole bunch of these other states utilize ADA services. So their websites are down, their ability to receive payments for dues. So typically when you have membership with ADA, you also have your state level and your regional components. And so nobody's getting paid right now. and from those dues because they're not able to collect dues. And so it's not just their website is down. It's very much permeated throughout the entire dental industry. And the real concern is that we're going to see long-lasting effects of this for years to come.
What exactly is ransomware? Is there a hacker that is kind of holding your website and all the information hostage until you pay?
Kind of. So, I mean, the visual that we all have is it's the solo guy, this weirdo that's living in their mom's basement. And that's how it used to be. Fast forward 20 years, and now they're nation state sponsored. China, Russia, North Korea, US, Iran is pretty large. Mexico's is most interesting to me because it's run by the cartels and they just kidnap smart people. So we'll never be going to Mexico because my husband looks super nerdy and we would totally get kidnapped. Well, I mean,
stick to Florida or Nashville. Yeah, stay in the States.
Yeah. I'm in California. It's an extension of Mexico. It used to be Mexico, so I'm good. But ransomware, it used to be that you would typically get an email and it would have an attachment. You'd open the attachment. It would run this program that would lock all your files and pop a message up on your screen that would say, you have 2 weeks to pay us X number of dollars in Bitcoin, which is cryptocurrency. It's basically untraceable, or you can revert to a backup. And a lot of people still have really terrible backups. I actually was in an office last week where they still had a tape backup. And I still see people that rotate USB backups daily. And I mean, there's all kinds of ways to do this, but there's a standard of care and we have to keep up with what's happening now. And now what the hackers are doing is they're going into offices that don't have basic security, like even a firewall, and they're hacking in, extracting all of the data, holding it hostage, still deploying that ransomware program. So and then they're saying, well, we deleted all your backups or you don't have access to your backups. So you have to pay the ransom. And we even if your backups do work, we don't care. We still have a copy of your data and we're selling it on the dark web. So you need to pay us. And they're asking for huge amounts. And now we're seeing double extortion where they're going into the data set and they're finding patient information and they're calling the patients directly and trying to extort them as well.
Wow.
So it's changed so much in the last few years. Just, I mean, seriously, once COVID started and everybody started working from home and trying to figure out how to use technology and buying a whole bunch of stuff without understanding how it works or how to secure it, the hackers were having a field day because they've been working from home forever. So they know how to manipulate everyone.
Yeah, so true.
It's super fun.
Yeah.
I'm being very sarcastic. It's
I
really
imagine,
not.
COVID just made things worse. Everyone working from home and on the computer. Kara, I wanted to start to wrap things up and I wanted to ask you a two-parter here. And then Amy, I'm going to finish off with you with the same two-part question. First of all, how do we get a hold of you? And second of all, if you could advise any, young dental professional just coming out of school, opening up a new practice, or a young entrepreneur, what kind of advice would you give them?
The first question, email is usually pretty good, Kara, Kara, @clinicalhr.com. And then I also share my cell with clients, 512-876-4866. Call or text, either way. I try to meet you where you're at as far as communication goes. And the piece of advice I think I would give is to not let HR be the last thing on your list. I see that all the time. They get their practice loan, whether they're acquiring or starting up, and they have this laundry list of people that they need to engage. Sometimes it's a practice management consultant. They definitely need a dental CPA. There's a lot of people who should be part of that team, but HR needs to be there as well, because as soon as you have one team member, you already need HR. And I see this where they've been in practice for several months or several years and they don't have an employee handbook. They don't have any systems in place. They are losing team members and don't know why. They're having trouble, or they've gotten in trouble with IRS, DOL, or the state unemployment office for one thing or another. So my advice would be to not let that be the last thing on your list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is great advice. And Amy, what about yourself?
My website is great, copperpennyconsulting.com, or my email, which is crazy long. It's education@copperpennyconsulting.com. And as far as advice, regulations don't exist for the people that do the right thing. They exist for people that don't know how to do the right thing, or they don't have the right information to do what they're supposed to do. So when I look at something like HIPAA or cybersecurity, I view it as more of a foundation piece. And if you have a good foundation with all of these, with HR, with cyber, with HIPAA, with infection control, all of these things are your foundation. So if you can build a strong foundation, the team members will be more attracted to you, and you'll be able to grow and build. And I know it's really tempting to skimp on things like marketing and foundation pieces and hiring a good person, even though they cost a little more. But those are the things that will definitely take your practice to another level. I've seen it time and time again.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. Again, Kara Kelly and Amy Wood, to our expert panel. And thanks again to all our viewers who are watching this live or the recording. We truly appreciate it. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks so much.